I think we can get started. It's 4 p.m. my time. I'm located in the Netherlands, so it's time to get started with this webinar. So good afternoon, morning, or evening, everyone, because we have faculty from all over the world. Please remember to mute yourself whenever you're not speaking. All slides and links referenced in this webinar will be sent out along with the recording in the April edition of the Light Center PD2Go newsletter. If you have not received this newsletter right into your inbox, please send me your email on the chat box and I will make sure that you get it. We send this newsletter every month with lots of resources and tasks that you can create with your students. So welcome to today's webinar. My name is Evelyn Ojeda and I'm the Light Center Professional Development Coordinator. This is the very first webinar that we organized specifically for, it's for all faculty, but specifically for affiliate institutions faculty. So I'm really excited to be here. So I would like to welcome you all, and I'm really excited also that you are attending our monthly webinars as well at Westcliff. So we're ready to get started with this session in which we will discuss academic honesty in higher education. This afternoon, Professor Jenkins will be facilitating this webinar. But so first of all, I would like to introduce him to the audience. Professor Solomon Jenkins. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
That's an acceptable variation.
Okay, thank you. Has worked as a linguistics researcher, professor, and academic program manager for various institutions, domestically and abroad. He spent most of his teaching and administrative career in Saudi Arabia, where he was responsible for curriculum design and development, program and staff evaluation, strategic planning for national government initiatives, academic advising, and language instruction. Professor Jenkins earned a BA in law from Amherst College and an MA in TESOL from New York University. He loves publishing academic articles on language and social justice and has published a book called Life is Wrong, the story of a reformed outlaw, which was inducted into the Universal Hip Hop Museum, set to open in 2023. Congratulations, Solomon. He has recently been appointed as the Director of Academic Programs at Johns Hopkins Institute for Nanobiotechnology. So, wow, this is really good news. So, congratulations on your new post, and thank you so much for facilitating today's session. So, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the kind words. Welcome everyone, wherever you are. It's always an honor. I've done this now, I think maybe the third time, presenting this topic, which is plagiarism and its relation to students in higher education. I'm very passionate about it because it is obviously a very prominent issue that we may face, but there's a lot of different factors towards it that I think some people may not necessarily know or they may overlook. So hopefully we'll examine those things today. It's very important, whenever I deliver workshops, it's important for me to get your input. It's not just me here, the expert on things. I'm sure you all have experience, right? You come with a wealth of knowledge as well. So it's very important to share that knowledge. Feel free to participate, to engage. There'll be plenty of moments throughout the workshop where I will ask questions. And so, just feel free. All right, so let's get into it. I will begin with just talking about the agenda. So we're going to first begin by trying to ascertain a working definition of plagiarism. All right. Then we'll look at the prevalence of plagiarism in higher education. And then after that, we'll look at the underlying reasons for plagiarism at a superficial level, and then in regards to unintentional versus intentional. And then we'll start to examine what are some of the deeper level reasons why students plagiarize. Then we'll look at the types of plagiarism committed by students. And then ultimately, what do we do, or how can we determine or detect plagiarism in students' work and the different ways that we can do that from a digital standpoint and from a physical standpoint. And then we'll talk about disciplining. So disciplining, what's the appropriate approach to disciplining students who commit plagiarism. So to begin, plagiarism is what again? Meaning, what would your definition of plagiarism be? What do you, based on a textbook definition, based on your experience, based on policy, what would you say is the definition of plagiarism? This is how we're going to get to a working definition. So who would like to throw it out there? What's your definition of plagiarism?
Well, I mean, the word is based on the Latin word plagi, which is actually kidnapping. So it would be, and I use the lens of theft. And so theft connotes a degree of intention. So it is, because we're going to talk, I'm sure you're going to talk about like accidental plagiarism, things like that, which seems to me like a contrary term, because if it's an accident type of thing, especially in academia, and there's different levels, master, masters, so forth. So, but if you lose the term of, is this theft? That would be a good basic place to start. Okay, at least in my opinion.
Yep. I remember you from last time, David. Welcome back. Angel, yes?
Hey, good morning, team. Hey, from my perspective, and I agree with the last comment, but with the caveat that at least on my perspective, most of the plagiarism and similarities encounters that I experience is being done in the unintentional way and aspect, especially when students, they try to somehow reference the article or whatever. They just trying to enhance the writing, but they're doing it in a wrong way per se. So it's kind of like a mix between those two, which is intentional, which I completely agree with the last conversation, and unintentional too. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. We'll tap on these in a little bit. Anyone else? Anyone else want to take a stab at it? Okay, so let's see what the textbook definition would be. So a textbook definition is the act of stealing, theft, appropriation of intellectual property not owned by the perpetrator. Okay, that is the textbook definition, I believe, is from Webster. Here's another definition from dictionary.com: the unauthorized use or close imitation of the language and thoughts of another author and the representation of them as one's own original work. Okay, so just one second. So in this, we see it mimics the some of the terminology that was used before by David in terms of stealing and theft. In terms of Angel, there's no mention yet of intentional versus intentional. So that's a very interesting point that we will pivot back to. Okay, but at this point, it's unauthorized stealing and theft and representation of that as one's own. Now, we're going to talk about a little bit more of the semantics of plagiarism, what it actually means and how it plays out. But it does have very real consequences, right? So it's not something that's just theorized in classes or, things that are written in books. These things actually happen, and there are actual real life penalties for it. One of them being, actually, let me see. Yeah, this is, one second here. Get this guy out of here. Yeah, so this is a German, he was a German minister of defense, and it's an egregious academic violation with potentially severe consequences. The German defense minister resigns over his thesis because at the time, after being appointed minister, it was found that he had plagiarized, and they said, nope, we can't have that. So he was asked to resign. Imagine how embarrassing that is to be in the position of Minister of Defense of a country, and you have to resign for having plagiarized, most of your dissertation. So it has very real consequences. Plagiarism has an unshakable stigma, especially in academia. Remember, in academia, it is the creation of knowledge, right? It's the creation of knowledge, and taking it a step further, just particularly in Western societies, knowledge can always be commodified, right? You can always turn an idea to money, right? So nobody wants to be stealing or have the ability to steal someone else's idea that can then become profitable. So it is a very, very serious thing in Western society. But our challenge as educators, especially when we teach all over the world, or when we are in the West, but teaching students who come from all over the world, the issue becomes, is plagiarism, that is the idea and the concept of plagiarism, that cut and dry. We'll see from the end of this presentation that it may not be, okay? And then in that case, how do we incorporate all the other factors that are involved in plagiarism to come up with a fair and balanced approach to it? So let's look at some plagiarism policy statements from various institutions at various levels. So Thomas Edison High School says it has a zero tolerance for plagiarism and cheating. We take these offenses quite seriously. Okay, great. This is a school out in New York. High school out in Australia, we regard plagiarism as academic dishonesty, theft, and an ethical offense. FGSH regards plagiarism as unacceptable behavior. Plagiarism is considered fraud and has potentially harsh consequences, including loss of job and loss of reputation. That's at Michigan State. Plagiarism is an intentional act of academic dishonesty and intellectual theft. This is a university out in Canada. And then we have the King, Oxford University plagiarism statement says, plagiarism may be intentional or reckless or unintentional. Under the regulations for examinations, intentional or reckless plagiarism is a disciplinary offense. Interesting. Now, I have a question. If we look at these policy statements, what would you say is similar between all the text that's highlighted, all the text in orange? What's the discourse surrounding plagiarism? What do you get? What picture do you get of plagiarism when you read these policy statements, particularly the ones that are highlighted in orange?
Somebody else's stuff.
Okay. Right. Okay.
Well, bad behavior.
Okay. There's like you said, taking someone's stuff, and also there's a behavioral aspect to it that is definitely bad. Okay. What else?
Unethical behavior.
Unethical. Okay. Good. What else? It's almost, in my opinion, it's almost like it's criminal, right? Look at the types of language used. Zero tolerance. Usually you have that for crimes, right? Things that you want absolutely not to happen in society. Dishonesty, theft, and ethical offense, fraud, intellectual theft, right? So again, we're just trying to build a case here that plagiarism, as we regard it in the West, right, has is definitely not acceptable. There's a fraud theft aspect to it, and it also has the stigma and the connotation of being something actually criminal, right? So it is very serious, right? But is all plagiarism the same? This is the question. Is all plagiarism the same? Now, what would you say is the approach of Oxford University? Do they have the same sort of language as the other ones? Or would you say it's a bit more balanced?
Well, they have a greater emphasis on, again, intent may be intentional. And they do include the reckless, which is interesting.
Okay, good. So good. Anyone else? Excellent.
Doesn't seem to have as harsh a disciplinary offense as opposed to some of these are practically you should be executed.
Exactly. Exactly. when you look at the discourse, the language used in the other ones, it's really like it's zero tolerance, harsh consequences, right? So it really suggests that plagiarism any type of plagiarism will not be accepted under any circumstances, right?
So it cannot be any unintentional. It will be always intentional, then it will be plagiarism.
So
I
you're
guess.
saying,
I don't know.
so you're saying there's no such thing as unintentional plagiarism?
Yeah.
I would like to intervene in here that might be at some point an instance that the author is not being aware that, he's involved in an act of plagiarism. So I think that unintentional plagiarism also happens when the author is unaware.
Excellent. I love this intellectual debate. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes. So I think we're arriving at a place where we're trying to really unpack what plagiarism is, and now we're coming to a point where some of us think that it's all intentional, some of us think that it might be intentional or unintentional. Okay. Anyone else want to add anything before we move on? Okay, if we look at Oxford, now Oxford obviously is one of the top universities, intellectual institutions in the world, right? They identify that plagiarism may be intentional or reckless, or it may be unintentional. And so I think it's very important to note that here we have an institution at the highest levels of academic achievement, academic production, intellectual production, and obviously they will be, among the most stringent in safeguarding intellectual, into the intellectual value of what's produced. Yet they say that plagiarism can be intentional or unintentional. So I think that's a very big point to look at. And not only do they say it's unintentional or intentional, but the punishment that is doled out to what? Under the regulations of examinations, intentional or reckless plagiarism is the one that is disciplined, and unintentional plagiarism is not. Okay, so that's very, very important. That
I have a question real quick.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So because of the fact that they're looking at the word plagiarism difference, would it be similar to say, like, if you work at a university, yep, and there's university pen that you put in your pocket and left, would you consider an accident? People do that all the time, type of thing.
Sure. Would
you consider that theft?
Right.
Because that's, in a sense, if you're looking at some of these definitions of plagiarism, if we're talking about unintentional, some people would consider that as something else, maybe reckless in that case, or as something else, or some people would say, yes, any action where you're taking something that doesn't belong to you is theft, because there's no motive, in a sense, behind it. So it would be similar to, that's how some of these are looking at it in that regard.
Yeah, I would say that in that instance, I would consider it, theft, because if it was clear that it was clearly labeled, that these pens are not to be taken. If you go to a conference or you go to somewhere and there's a whole bunch of pens labeled, just out there on the table, right? Then someone might take it thinking that these are free. So in that case, a person may take it thinking that it's free, but had they known that it wasn't free, they might not have taken it, right? So
yeah, exactly.
So, as long as the policies are clear, as long as we're going to talk about policy in a little bit, but also, I think in general, no culture condones theft, right? No, theft is not something that, I don't think that cultures, any culture inherently believes is okay. But again, when we're talking about plagiarism, you have to enter the realm of talking about what constitutes knowledge, right? And in some cultures, the way knowledge is constituted, or the way it is reproduced, there's a different perspective on the formation of knowledge and who has control of it. And that's something that's very real and that needs to be addressed. We'll talk about it a little bit in the, as we move on. So yeah, so very good point. So we'll move on, but keep these ideas in the back of your mind as we continue to progress. So Oxford identifies that there's an intentional layer of plagiarism and there's an unintentional. So let's see what that means. All right. So before we get into some of the nitty-gritty of what are the underlying reasons for why students plagiarize, let's look at the prevalence of it, because it is a problem, right? So plagiarism has always, unfortunately, been a part of higher education. Once the internet came on the scene, plagiarism just absolutely metastasized and just grew to absolutely ridiculous portions. I had lots of issues at the previous university I was at with plagiarism. It's just something that we, with the advent of the internet and the ease of being able to copy and take information that's not yours, it is, it's a very serious problem. The Independent reported back in 2014 that there was about 50,000 students getting caught for plagiarism in the UK, which is just an absolutely massive number of students cheating. Those are the ones who were caught. Now imagine how many were not, right? Another UK organization, Quality Assurance Agency, issued a formal complaint to the Advertising Standards Agency calling for a formal ban on search engine ads for essay mill companies. Apparently there was just an absolute skyrocket at the time of students searching for essay mills, companies that produce essays for you. So it is quite a problem. I'll ask this question. We'll keep it short as we can in terms of the answers. But what would be your experiences with plagiarism? Would you say it's something that's quite frequent in your classes? Would you say it's something that has been on the rise in recent years? What would you say your experiences, particularly with plagiarism, have been?
I think here many students commit plagiarism and there are many causes for it. I think the first cause is many students do not know what exactly constitutes plagiarism, and similarly they do not know why originality matters. A second reason I have found many students do not know how to cite properly sources. As a result, they fall prone to the plagiarism. And the next idea, what I think, they do not have confidence towards their idea. And lastly, I think many students have to meet deadline. As a result, they love copying ideas from other sources, or they borrow ideas from their friends' writing. That is what I have found throughout my teaching.
Excellent. And all these causes we will revisit in just a minute. Would you say that plagiarism is very frequent in your classes, or is it sort of something you encounter time to time, or what would you say about that, the frequency?
It depends on the students. Few students make it frequently, but few students try to avoid plagiarism as well.
Okay, excellent. Anyone else?
It depends on how capable they are.
Sure.
I agree with my fellow colleague that plagiarism is a common experience. However, I would like to add one thing, that specifically for the students who are in their DBA program, if they come up with a unique idea for their own, like many of my students have come up with a unique idea, in their case, I have found the issue of plagiarism is relatively less. However, if you talk about the students who tend not to think creatively and tend to copy out, or they find something common from other authors, in their case plagiarism is a common issue. But again, similar workshops if we conduct, so I think plagiarism issue can be overcome with the students as well. But yes, right kind of awareness should be there in faculties as well.
Excellent. Okay, excellent. All right, let's move on. Okay, because again, we're still at the surface layer of this, and we only have about 35 minutes. So I really want to get to unpacking, sort of the cognitive and cultural aspects of plagiarism that we may not be familiar with. All right, so plagiarism is bad. There are severe penalties. Plagiarism is prevalent, as we established. So why do students do it? Well, we have touched on quite a few reasons. All right. So why do students plagiarize? There are myriad reasons why students plagiarize. But in my opinion, it is fundamental to the framework of understanding plagiarism is understanding intentional versus unintentional plagiarism. I think that this is very, very, very key. As Professor David mentioned, you know, someone might take a pen, right? But if somebody intended to steal it, that's something different than someone taking it by mistake, not knowing that they were not for, you know, it wasn't for everyone to take because there's no sign, right? So it had someone known ahead of time that these were not, these was not for consumption, then they would not have taken it. Whereas, you know, yeah, somebody would have taken it regardless if there's a sign, if there's no sign, right? So you have to make this distinction, and we have to understand what constitutes intentional plagiarism versus unintentional. That's the big key point. It's also important to understand that the dynamic of plagiarism might operate differently depending on local students versus international students, right? So students who are in the States, who are from the States or spend a significant time in the States, they may have already acclimated to the understanding of ideas and how they are generated and the issue of plagiarism and things like this. Whereas in other cultures, again, the approach to knowledge formation, where knowledge is stored, who has access to the knowledge, who has ownership of the knowledge is, you know, it can vary drastically from culture to culture. We're going to talk about that. Is the difference, there might be different characteristics between local students as opposed to international students with regards to frequency of plagiarism, how they plagiarize, things like this. In my opinion and in my experience, so I was, you know, I'm fortunate to work at Johns Hopkins now as a director, but I spent about 9 years working in Saudi as a writing program supervisor. And I was responsible for about 4 levels of the whole program, but it was about 4 levels of courses from the lowest level all the way up to graduate level. And I've come across many cases of plagiarism, but I really honestly have to say not every case is the same, right? There are cases where clearly student has plagiarized, you know, it's just, you know, huge swaths of, you know, text copied from one to the other. You know, that's pretty easy. But then there are some cases again where, you know, students really don't understand. As someone mentioned, I forget who, someone mentioned they may understand the concept, but they may not understand the referencing. So the method of referring to first sources, they may get that mixed up. So they don't intentionally plagiarize, but they actually don't know the mechanics of referencing systems. So again, each case, you know, I would say, you know, just be judicious in how you approach it. And it's, yeah, it's, you know, obviously it's not couth to make generalizations about all different types of students, right? I would take every student on an individual basis. But why do students plagiarize? That's what we're going to get into. So in my opinion, there are a number of reasons why students intentionally plagiarize, and many of us have mentioned these already. They are anything from too much pressure. So they have so many things to do in other courses, and they have an assignment due, and it's like, okay, well, I don't have any time to do this. Let me go to the internet. Sometimes it's just easier to plagiarize, right? The internet is right there. So why go through all this work when I can just easily either pay someone to do it for me, or, you know, find these essay mill workshops, these essay mill companies. Poor time management. So not scheduling or not managing their time properly with a project, you know, for business or project for English or whatever. And so they're pressed for time and they, you know, end up plagiarizing. Pressures to succeed. In some families, some cultures, there's a lot of pressure, tremendous pressure to get high grades. And so, you know, a student may not necessarily be strong in a particular skill or a particular subject, but their pressure is so strong to succeed. They say, I'm going to achieve by any means necessary. Lack of language proficiency. Language definitely plays a role, especially when you're doing interdisciplinary work. So, you know, someone whose English is not that great, but they're doing a project in science or in math or in business, they may be tempted to plagiarize. As we mentioned as well, temptation due to the internet. Fear of failure. Okay, actually, so it should just be two separate ones. So fear of failure, which is somewhat related to pressures of the pressure to succeed, and just sheer laziness. Some people are just straight up lazy, some students. Good. They also believe that they won't be caught, which is kind of funny in this digital age where everything is available everywhere. And you have these very high-powered plagiarism detection programs that can locate literally anything anywhere. So it's kind of foolish to believe that they won't be caught, but somebody just, you know, some people just, you know, they take that chance. And then there's also some that just don't think that plagiarism is that serious, you know, and, you know, this may be people coming from outside of the West, where, you know, plagiarism is not necessarily standard, because again, I don't believe any culture inherently believes that theft is okay. But there are, you know, instances where people might assume or, you know, tend to plagiarize because that's just what everybody else does. When you get to the unintentional reasons, okay, so we looked at the intentional reasons. I'm interested to see, for those of you who believe in unintentional reasons, what might be some of the reasons why a student may plagiarize unintentionally, meaning that plagiarism is committed, but they do not understand why what they did is an offense.
Hello, I think it's early stage of education. As one of the colleagues mentioned it, you see a lot of plagiarism, either way intentional or unintentional at the early stage, at the undergraduate level, and as a student continue to evolve all the way to the doctorate candidacy, that's where you see very minimum, if any, of plagiarism. Thank you.
Okay, so it's a level thing. Okay, good. Someone else?
Maybe they don't know exactly what plagiarism is, because the idea they may be taking from somebody, but they want to correct themselves. And sometimes it may be in between plagiarism and their own idea. So they don't know exactly the definition of plagiarism.
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
I don't know.
So
that will be then unintentional if that were be the case, if they don't know. But if they know the definition of plagiarism, then obviously it is intentional.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so we have a small shift I see in your language, because before you were saying is, you know, all plagiarism is intentional, and now, you know, I see that there's a shift
because the definition, because they don't know exactly
right
what plagiarism is. If they don't know, then it will be not intentional or unintentional.
Right. Excellent.
But if it is an intentional, or if they know the definition, then it will always be intentional.
Exactly.
I mean, can I ask you a question? Is that how, because I think one of the things we all also have to come across is the fact that student may intentionally do something, but then say, oh, well, I didn't know. Or like I had one student told me that in my culture, it's an honor to take other people's work. I mean, so this is obviously, you know, so I think that's the hard part for us, is that the excuse, one of the things that we have a plagiarism repository. So we have a student, they did plagiarism, we put it in there, they do, and then they say, oh, we'll never do it again, we'll never do it again. And what was happening, they'd go to another class and plagiarize, and if they got caught or not. So we have this repository because we have a third time the student has said, oh, no, I didn't know that was plagiarism. Yeah, that's what you said last class, and that's what you said the class before that. So, and it takes up a lot of our resources, and I think we all agree, it's a small percentage.
Sure.
It's a very, very small percentage. Or you have the students that, because they have YouTube videos to show you how to cheat, turn it in.
Right.
There's mechanical things to do. And so if you're doing that, man, you're going way out of your way to to hide your plagiarism.
Right.
which
right.
is to me a lot more work than it's worth, but
Right.
nevertheless.
Right. I mean, yeah, we're gonna touch on that when we get to the discipline stage. But yeah, a very, very interesting points. YR, but you had your hand raised. Someone had their hand raised. Okay. All right. All right. Good. So yeah, go ahead. KC.
Professor
Yeah.
Bahata, you can go ahead from King's College.
Okay. All right. No worries. Yeah, go ahead. Whoever raised their hand. Is the mic working?
Yes, we can hear you, or at least I can hear you.
No, I know my mic is working, but the person who raised the person who raised their hand. Okay. All right. Well, we'll we'll continue. So again, the unintentional reasons that you propose. Let's see if some of those appear here. So poor understanding or ignorance of referencing and plagiarism. So that goes back to Govinda's point about if you know what plagiarism is, then you should be held accountable. But if you don't, then that would be considered unintentional. There's a carelessness, right, in note taking. So students may take notes and then not be able to determine what was actually their notes and what was actually the words of the text. Okay, so that also that also happens. There are surface conceptions of learning as a reproduction of knowledge. So how knowledge is constructed, some students don't have, they can't really transition from however knowledge is produced in their culture as opposed to how it is produced in Western culture. And that's what that speaks to Professor Davis' point about them saying, oh, it's an honor for me to use so and such and such's work. And that comes from the fact that in other cultures, knowledge, once it's created, it is in the public domain for anybody to consume. And who produced it is not important. What is important is that this knowledge is, continuously reproduced and referenced, right? Whereas in the West, knowledge, when it's produced, is automatically in the private domain. You cannot have access to that unless you go to the person and ask them permission to use it, which is a form, which we do by referencing, right? So you use it with the caveat that, this is not my work. I didn't produce this. It belongs to someone else. Another unintentional reason is working in a second language. So we mentioned language barriers. Some students may not understand the assignment, the task, right? And then they may not understand just maybe the plagiarism policy, things like this. A failure to understand the academic role of tasks. And then also there's a cultural background element. Also prior education. Sometimes, depending on the education of the student, they may not have come across plagiarism at all. And so by the time they get to college, they literally are encountering this idea for the first time. But we have this issue of cultural background. And this is something I'm going to pivot to now, because I believe that this is something that's not really discussed as much in plagiarism. It's something very important. If we look at writing in the English language, writing is a phenomenally complex language skill. It's very, very, very difficult. It's the last one to be developed. Some cultures today are still completely oral. They don't have a writing. Aspect to the language. And this is someone we're going to refer to quite a lot. Robert Kaplan. Writing is not universally the same. So we have to understand that writing across different cultures is not the same, which means that how cultures approach writing, the expression of ideas, the storage of knowledge is not the same, right? And so there's a branch of linguistics called contrastive rhetoric that looks at the different writing systems and how they, what features are similar and different between them. So in my opinion, writing is as much a cultural exercise as it is an exercise in developing students' skills. So you have to understand, when you're asking your students to write in English, it is a cultural thing that we're asking them to do, because how they express ideas in their natural culture or their first language is not the same, may not be the same as we express ideas in English. So we have to take that into consideration. There's a logic issue when it comes to writing in general. There's difference. So logic, which is the basis of rhetoric, is evolved out of culture. It is not universal. So the logic of how you present ideas is not the same from culture to culture. So we have to admit that, people going from, transitioning from culture to culture, there's a lot going on beyond just simply doing a task. Thought patterns are different. So there's no one that's better than the other. I'm not saying that English is better than all other language, but because we are in English-speaking countries or in English-speaking programs, they have to deal with English, but we're not saying that one system is better or worse. We're just saying that they are different. Robert Kaplan proposed that we must take these cultural differences, or we must make these cultural differences overtly apparent to our students. It's important, and I don't know how this functions at Westcliff, but one feature that I had of my writing programs is that I had, in the beginning of every student's career, there would be a small workshop on what English writing is about, or what academic writing in an institution is expected in terms of, the logic of it, and then also in terms of, the conveying of ideas and things like this, and how that is specifically a Western, or in my case, American thing. This is an American approach. I always tell my students, you guys are talking, in circles. We like everything direct and to the point. So you have to shift from whatever it is you do in your own language and shift out of that and understand that this is what English speakers expect. So sometimes we gloss over that and think that that's an easy, natural transition for students, and in many cases it is not. So I agree with Robert Kaplan that we make these cultural differences overtly apparent to students. If we look here, we see that there's tremendous difference between the English language and the Chinese language. English is linear in approach, whereas Chinese, it's circular in approach. So you can talk about something and relate to it whatever you want, even if it's not directly related to the point. In English, the onus of responsibility is on the writer. So if you come to a text and it is not clear, it is not concise, this is a problem that needs to be addressed by the writer. That means that the writer did a poor job. Whereas in Chinese language, the onus of the responsibility is on the reader. The writer can write whatever he or she wants, right? In the way that they feel. Your job as a reader is to interpret it in the best way. So if you don't get it, if you didn't interpret it correctly, then that's your problem, not my problem as the writer. All right. So again, that's a pretty drastic difference in expectation, in how you construct text and things like this. In English language, it's methodical, it's predictable. In some cases, it can be quite boring. Whereas in Chinese language, and this was from a Professor Zing, it may be considered their thought patterns, or the way that the way that they write in Chinese. If you translate that directly into English, it may be considered irrelevant, illogical, and unclear. Whereas in Chinese culture, it's it might be a work of art, right? In English language, there's a cultural value on directness, so getting to the point and making everything straight. Whereas in Chinese culture, there's a cultural value placed on saving face and it's not sort of being direct. So again, writing might not be straight up in your face. You have to sort of figure things out. So these are two salient examples of how language is different and approach is different. Construction of words and sentences and paragraphs and things like this are different. So there has to be this underpinning in your mind when you're thinking about plagiarism, because there's a lot of things at stake beyond just, okay, this student copied this from this. And we have to sort of go a little bit fast because we're running out of time and so many things to talk about. So teaching writing and teaching just in general, just anything involving writing is as much a cultural practice as it is a language skill exercise. Where possible, try to get learners to understand the fundamental principles that drive expression in the English language. And again, obviously some of you are business professors, so English is not your, that's not your forte, or it's not your responsibility. But I would say for the English language support program or extension at Westcliff, that they, squeeze into their curriculum some sort of workshop or series of academic sessions on what English language is and what factors of it are important in your academic career and in plagiarism. So how do the two relate? You have to account for the cognitive and cultural influences on your students' writing. As we mentioned, thought patterns and organization, they're the drivers of how they construct knowledge. And also, if you're, so for instance, some of you all are in Dubai, I understand, some of you are in Nepal, I understand. So it might help for you to understand how writing operates in the student's culture so that you can anticipate what issues you might have that might come up in their writing, when they're writing for an English audience. So when we have plagiarism, this is usually what happens. You have the student profile, right? And so the student comes with their language proficiency, their awareness of academic conventions, whether they're a local student versus an international student, their understanding of the subject, and then their own personal integrity. How willing are they to cheat, right? Then you have the pressure factors in plagiarism, right? So competitiveness, as we talked about, deadlines, competency, cultural influence. There's, in some cases, cultures like to share. Sharing things is very important, so even with knowledge, right? And then we have the tasks. So you have a writing assignment, a project in business, or report. So all of these factors come in and they're all related. So these two, the student profile and the pressures, will influence how this writing assignment or project or report is done. So all of these factors are at play when we are coming to these assessment tasks, and then you receive them, and now you have to sift through, okay, what is the student's work and what is not. The types of plagiarism committed: a student might plagiarize using one of the following methods. They might simply copy an assignment from the internet. They might use an old assignment of an old friend. They might use the same assignment but in a different class. I think Professor Davis was alluding to this, right? So the student uses the same thing and then goes to another class and then, uses the same excuse about why, but really they're just trying to game the system. They might forget to use proper citation techniques. And again, I use forget in parentheses because, as Professor David mentioned, some students try to use the same excuse all the time, but there are some students that, genuinely do forget. So, it's always sort of a catch-22. They might purchase a paper from the paper mill. And in some cases, this is the most difficult one, is they might hire someone to write their assignments. So sometimes plagiarism won't catch it. Like you might see a student and you might have a baseline assignment at the beginning of the class. This is something that I do to make sure I can see where students' level is. So I give them some basic tasks on the very first day of class, tell me about yourself, whatever. And then I use that to be able to compare throughout the semester. Okay, this is what you wrote on the first day. Now your assignment is drastically different than this. And so, if you run it through a plagiarism software, a lot of times they catch it, but sometimes you may get an assignment for the student. It's drastically different than what they produced on the first day. You run it through the plagiarism software, it comes up with zero. Nothing, nothing matches. It's supposedly all original. For sure this person didn't do that. What are you talking about, right? This usually happens when they hire somebody who's a very good writer, pay the money, and then they actually produce the work themselves. So that's a very difficult type of detection. And then some students use, they just translate from their native language to English using Google. So you think you know how your students might plagiarize, okay? Yeah, we don't have time to have an engaging discussion about this, but there are different ways to detect how students plagiarize. What are the ways? Well, there are salient ways and there are subtle ways. The salient ways are things like, as I mentioned, there's drastic fluctuations in style and language at the text level. So student, A, who's a sophomore, or a freshman, is writing as if they are a doctoral student, right? Or a published scientist or a published business person, right? It doesn't make sense, right? So the language is just too advanced for their level. There's no in-text citation. So you might give students projects. Obviously, you're expecting some reference, referencing being done, yet you look throughout the whole text and there's nothing, no quotes, no nothing, right? Glaring formatting issues. So, some people are so lazy that they will literally copy and paste from one document, keeping the same font, not bothering to change it, right? You have bold here and, Helvetica, right? And then, but their whole assignment is in Times New Roman, and they didn't bother to change it, or they're too lazy, or they didn't have time, right? So that is easy for you, as an educator to spot. But then there's the subtle ways, the things that is kind of difficult to pick up. The language is higher than the student's current proficiency level, but you can't detect it by Turnitin or safe assign. The project doesn't specifically address the task at hand. So it's a very well-written paper, very well documented, but it's not really talking about the topic that you gave them to write about, right? So that's kind of fishy. If it's talking about a topic that was sort of similar to this in a previous class or in a previous semester, right? But they said, okay, he's talking about this topic in general. Let me try my fortune. There are physical ways to detect plagiarism, and there are digital ways. What strategies can we use to detect plagiarism? Well, obviously you have the naked eye, right? Just looking at the text, you can be able to tell, and you just trust your gut feeling. Like this is just a little bit beyond what the student is capable of doing. You can have conferences with students. I've done this before, and obviously it has to be sensitive because you don't want to accuse anybody. But again, it's been the case where I've met with students and I've said, oh, this is a really interesting point. Can you explain that further? And then all of a sudden they're like, and you're like, okay, well, I mean, you did write it, right? And they're like, yeah. So, well, can you, expand on what you meant here? I didn't really understand, right? Or ask them about vocabulary words. I've had the case where I've had students, use all these big words that I don't even know, right? And I'm a prolific writer and reader, and I'm asking him, okay, do you know the definition of this? And they can't answer, right? So when you have these conferences with students, you can easily ascertain whether they actually done the work or not. But you have to be sensitive because you don't want to accuse the students. Coincidence, I'm not really sure what did I mean by that. Probably, yeah, probably matching something that you've come across in a previous semester or a previous assignment. That's probably what I meant by coincidence. But then there's also a digital aspect of plagiarism detection, where generally you use these online detection programs. They're very, very thorough. I'm not sure what is used at Westcliff, but they're generally very, very thorough, and they can detect matching. So which percentage of the text matches with what's on the internet. And so that is very helpful. So two major ones are Turnitin and safe assign. At Westcliff, there is a policy, right? So the policy is very clear. It says plagiarism is the deliberate copying of written work. So Westcliff acknowledges that there is an intentional or unintentional aspect to plagiarism. Is a deliberate copying of work at any length. It is considered unethical, a violation of university rules, and it is against U.S. copyright law. It's also a breach of academic integrity. plagiarism, deliberate plagiarism, unethical, and can have serious consequences for the student's future career. So I like the fact that, you know, Westcliff makes an emphasis on the fact that it is deliberate and not, you know, and not unintentional. Here's the policy. So if a student is determined by the dean and other stakeholders to have done plagiarism, if there's any indication of plagiarism by a student, the faculty will review the materials and submit it to turn it in for verification. If verification of plagiarism is confirmed, the student will allocate a grade of 0 for the student. The faculty member will then meet with the student and review the offense. Okay. Now, I think Professor Day was asking, well, what do we do in this case where a student, you know, comes to you and he or she says, I didn't know this and that. At the end of the day, you know, I myself personally, I tend to err on the side of leniency where leniency is appropriate, right? But because I think that students should be educated about plagiarism if they don't know what plagiarism is, rather than be penalized for it and they don't know. But again, if you have certain policies that are set in stone and written, then you have to obviously apply the policy that has been set forth. And then they go into a lot more detail about, you know, about the different steps of how you deal with plagiarism. So Professor Eve is going to send this this presentation to you. You can go through this yourself and look at the policy and try to apply it as, you know, as best you can. But really, in my opinion, laying down the law, I think we have to be a bit strategic and again, and lenient where leniency is possible. How do we address plagiarism in higher education? In my opinion, the approach has to be didactic and not immediately punitive. Why? Because again, some students will plagiarize, or an act of plagiarism will be committed, but the student is not necessarily, they didn't have the devious intention to mislead you, right? Or to pass something off as their own. They simply do not know either, or they do not know what plagiarism is. They were never told about it. They have very poor referencing skills. So these are things that need to be taken into account. Cultural roles, academic skills, language proficiency. I wrote a piece back in 2018 about how we developed a plagiarism policy at my university. And I said, you know, why you have to take cultural context into consideration. I said, thus plagiarism policies in EFL, so teaching English as a foreign language context, need to consider the role of the academic writing tradition in the student's native language. So it's important to understand how the language functions in, how writing functions in the student's native language. And it's important to develop an induction or intervention plan whose primary purpose is educating learners about the expectations of Western scholarship. So it's important for you to take a didactic approach to plagiarism when it is clear that it's an unintentional case of plagiarism. When it is intentional, then yes, I agree. You know, someone's trying to pass something off, they're trying to be devious, they're trying to game the system. No, those people should be punished. But when it's a case of unintentional plagiarism, we should take it as an opportunity to teach the students conceptually what plagiarism is, you know, from a cultural perspective, why plagiarism is not acceptable in the West, you know, because of the ownership of knowledge and things like this. But at the end of the day, like I said, adhere to university's policy and be flexible where flexibility is allowed. Thank you very much. If anyone has any comments in the last 2 minutes, please share.
I have a question for you. You're at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah.
And obviously some of the most, especially when it comes to medical research and so forth, advanced the world, do they have the same type of in say the med school or the in those areas, the same type of tolerance for it? And the other part was in these other languages, and I say this because I have no idea, in say, you mentioned, for instance, the linguistic differences in Mandarin and so forth than the West, but how do they do academic, say scientific writing? Do they have you know, because in that you have to be precise in the harder sciences.
Right.
So you can't talk in, I can't picture that. Or do they in their languages still talk in circles? And I'm saying it poorly, but I think you get what I'm trying to say.
Sure. Just quickly, John Hopkins, I actually have not reviewed the plagiarism policy because my role is like almost strictly administrative and not academic. But I will, and I can sort of get. But I would imagine that, especially with science, things like that, you really have no gray area. Things have to be pretty tight and strict when you're producing, top research in the world. And then your second question was what?
The linguistic part of it, because if in other, you mentioned that like for again lack of a better term, the Chinese speak in, when I say speak in circles, I'm trying to paraphrase what you said there. Do they do that in all fields, or do they do that? Like I said, I'm thinking in scientific terms in their papers.
Yeah.
Like the hard sciences. Do they still talk in circles in those?
Right. I would imagine that in hard sciences, engineering, things like that, it'd be kind of difficult. To, be indirect because you have a certain task and it's sort of hard data and things like that. But more so when you have ideas that you have to express sort of in the literary fields or in business when you have to explain, projects or concepts or things like this. I think that it would be, that's most of the area where you would see the sort of circular reasoning. And again, it's not anything one is better than the other. It's just that, this is their approach.
Okay, well, we have to stop right now. I know that 1 hour is not enough to talk about academic honesty and everything that involves avoiding plagiarism in the student's paper, but because of time, we need to stop right now. It's been an hour. I just want to thank Professor Jenkins for facilitating this webinar. It was very interesting, and I will make sure that everyone gets a recording from this presentation along with the PowerPoint presentation. And I don't want to say goodbye before inviting you. You already have a Google invite in your inbox, but remember that we have 2 sessions on Monday dealing with discussion questions and how to use those discussion questions to boost engagement in online settings. So please don't miss it. It's going to be very interesting. We're going to be discussing the importance of it and some tips and tricks concerning discussion questions. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. I know it's Saturday, we should be with family, so the fact that you're here means a lot. So thanks everyone, and wait for the email with the recordings and the PowerPoint presentation. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, take care.